welcome. We have with us today Amira Hassenbush. Have I pronounced that correctly, Amira?
Hazenbush. It's okay. Everybody
Hazenbush. I always get it wrong. It's the English pronunciation.
That's right.
I'm Warren Shield. I'm a family law attorney in Los Angeles. Very happy to have Amira here. You're the first person we've invited back for a second. And we're going to be talking about transgender issues. I just want to first say that Amira's actually very distinguished. You have a law degree from UCLA. You also have a public health degree as well from, is that UCLA or Berkeley?
My bachelor's degree is in public health from Berkeley. My master's in public health is from UCLA.
So in this present pandemic, you're a good person to seek information from. You know what you're talking about.
I can read the articles.
What is your expertise or experience with transgender issues in family law cases?
Yeah, so on a professional level, I spent 5.5 years working for the Williams Institute. The Williams Institute is an LGBT research center. It focuses on law and policy issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity. And in my work there, I did research on transgender parenting, on discrimination against transgender people, on sort of the transgender experience in a variety of contexts. Since then, I've started and run my own private practice, which includes working with gay and transgender clients. I help people with name and gender changes, and I have actually represented a supportive parent of a transgender child in a custody battle. So I've done some work on this.
Well, before we kick off, I don't want to make any mistakes or show my age or what generation I am, but could you take us through some of the terms so that I can try and get the terminology correct and not offend anyone who's watching?
Yeah, and I think it's important to know that if you are coming to it with the right intent, it's perfectly okay to ask questions, but just because you have one transgender friend, maybe don't ask all your questions to that person, right? You can either go to somebody who says that they know a lot about it and is willing to talk about it, like me, or use the internet. It's quite amazing what you can find on Google these days. But transgender is sort of an umbrella term, so it refers to anyone whose gender identity doesn't match their sex assigned at birth. So maybe I should go back and talk about gender identity and sex assigned at birth. So sex assigned at birth is when you're born as a baby and the doctor looks between your legs and says boy or girl and puts that on your birth certificate. That's your sex assigned at birth. Your gender identity is sort of your internal feeling of maleness or femaleness. For most of us, our internal feeling of maleness or femaleness matches our sex assigned at birth, and we would be called cisgender. So for example, I was born and assigned female at birth, and I still identify as a woman, so I'm cisgender. Transgender means that there's a mismatch there. So it could be that someone completely transitions and is, for example, a trans man would be a person who identifies as male but was assigned female at birth. A transgender woman is a person who identifies as female but was assigned male at birth. And then there's a whole spectrum in between there of non-binary people who don't identify as either male or female. There are people who sort of recognize that gender is a spectrum and they say that they're trans-masculine, where they don't go all the way to man. So there's or trans-feminine, right? There's a very large umbrella there that can include a lot of different kinds of people.
Now, I mean, this is all new stuff for a lot of attorneys and a lot of judges. So I think that you talked about transitions. So in the context of a family law conflict, the transition would usually end up at one end of the spectrum in reassignment surgery. Is that right? So could you explain what that transition is, what the spectrum is?
Yeah, and not necessarily. So transgender people may or may not undergo medical procedures to sort of reflect their gender identity in their body. And there are many people who undergo medical transition. So medical transition can go anywhere from hormone therapy to surgery. There are kind of two different contexts where we may see transition in the family law context, right? One is with transgender parents, and one is with transgender children. Usually with trans parents, the choice of social or hormonal or some sort of physical transition their choice as to what feels appropriate for their life and their body is only really relevant to the extent that it has an impact on their relationship with the child. So generally speaking, asking questions about what's in someone's pants is just not appropriate, whether the person is cisgender or transgender, right? And the same is true, when you're in a family law context, what is between someone's legs is really not appropriate, because hopefully when they're with their child, the kid's not seeing what's between their parents' legs, right? If they are, then that's a different question. That doesn't have to do with gender dysphoria or gender identity or anything like that. Now, with a child, though, right, you are often dealing with parents who are battling out over whether the child is transgender and what transition is appropriate. And often for younger children, the transition is only social. So there's not any medical stuff at the youngest ages. It's usually just letting the kid wear their hair the way they want to, letting the kid dress the way they want to, letting the kid use the name and pronouns that feel appropriate for that child. But even that can be a battle between parents. And so, then getting to the steps of hormones and medical transition are usually not until later on in the child's life, and all of those, each step can be challenging.
You're okay if I drink a cup of coffee after that explanation? It's sort of like very confusing. I want to
You can always ask me more questions and tell me to slow down if I'm not clear.
So I want to put that in a sort of framework. Let's start with children. So as a family law attorney in California, the two concepts we're dealing with usually is, when we've got two parents who are separated and they're arguing over the rights they have in relation to their minor children. We talk about legal custody and physical custody, who they're going to spend time with, and legal custody is which parent makes decisions regarding their health, education, and general welfare. And so I think it's fair to say that in California, the default position, all other things being equal, is when it comes to legal custody, the power to make decisions, we tend to defer to joint custody. We think it's a good idea that both parents communicate and cooperate in making important decisions. Now, let's say you've got a transgender teen, like a 16 or 17-year-old, and the teen says, I have gender dysphoria, I identify as a different gender, the one that I was assigned at birth, and I want to start transitioning. And one parent is all for it. And the other parent says, no, I think it's a bad thing. And so they go to court. And I recently had a very similar case to this, and we assume that I don't know if you can back me up on this, but my guess is that if you ask members of the public, which parent do you think would be more in favor of encouraging the transition, you would think the mother. But in the case I had, it was actually the father. So this case now goes in front of the judge, and the judge has to make a decision about whether the teen can transition. So in terms of the judge making a decision, I guess that, the way we do that generally with all these big decisions is if the parents can't agree, the judge can assign legal custody to one of the parents to make those decisions. And that often, my practice, it most often comes up in the area of education, which schools the children go to, and medical decisions like vaccinations.
Right.
But what happens in a transgender case in that situation?
Right. Well, it is also, in many respects, a medical decision, especially if the child wants to medically transition. If the child wants to socially transition, it's not so much a medical decision, but it's the same kind of thing. So people treat it as though it's so different, but in many ways it's not, right? In many ways, it's a disagreement about how to raise your child, and the standard is best interest of the child. The problem is that many people are not exposed to transgender children and what that means. And so they're not educated. They don't really know how to determine if a child is transgender and what appropriate care is for a transgender child. So for parents who believe that their child may be transgender, and especially for parents where they know that they have a co-parent who is not going to be supportive regardless of the outcome, the first step is getting a diagnosis. So the first step is taking that child to a medical professional with expertise in gender fluid youth or transgender youth, and seeing if this child actually is transgender, as opposed to just kind of playing with gender for now. And, you know, a lot of young, like lots of little boys dress up in dresses. It doesn't make them transgender girls. You know, there's a lot of gender fluidity that we sort of socialize out of children from a very young age, when, you know, we have the boys' toys and the girls' toys and the dresses and the pants. And we as a society make a very clear delineation. But at younger ages, when kids aren't taught that, or before they're taught that, which I don't know that there ever exists a time before, you know, there is more fluidity. And so finding a time to be able to establish that this child is in fact transgender, they see usually a transgender child is consistent, insistent, and persistent in their gender identity, right? So the first step is getting that diagnosis and having an expert say, yes, in fact, this child is transgender. And then really it's about educating the judge about what that means and bringing in medical experts who can say, if this child has this diagnosis, this is what is in the child's best interest. This is what is going to be emotionally supportive to the child. And there's all kinds of research that shows that allowing children to live in a supportive home where they can express the gender that they identify with has major, major outcomes for better mental health, lower suicide risk, all kinds of things like that. So it's not just like a, well, you know, this is just going to change the child's hairdo, right? This is really an actual potential impact on the child's overall well-being. So it's really important to have medical experts who can explain that to the court.
We're in Los Angeles. Is there a good place to go, a first place to go, a resource for parents who have transgender teens, and they can then get referred out to doctors or psychologists?
Children's Hospital Los Angeles has a whole transgender unit, which is really fantastic. Dr. Joanna Olson is the doctor there. She's one of the foremost experts in the country. So that's where I would send people to go first, and then they can always refer out to other places from there.
Now, you referred earlier to like a diagnosis and some of the factors that go into making that diagnosis. And I think I'm going to get it wrong, but there was insistence, persistence. What was the other one?
And consistent.
And consistence. Well, what does that mean? What do they mean?
So consistent, right? That the child consistently says, this is who I am, you know, that it's not, yesterday I decided to, you know, put on a dress and today I'm back in pants and I don't really care, right? Like, that it is consistent, that it is insistent, right? That it's not just that the child is playing around with this, but that the child really, truly, clearly says, you know, often with transgender children as young as 3 or 4 years old, they will say, I am a boy or I am a girl. You know, they are very insistent. They're very clear that they know who they are and they're trying to express that. And persistent meaning over time, right? Even, you know, as years go on, this doesn't seem to be changing, that this seems to persist and remain the identity of the child.
So now I'm thinking, as a lawyer, how do I present this case? I'm thinking, in addition to the experts, and I've got Joanna Olson signed up as my key expert, and I got some psychologists. I'm thinking that I need to bring in maybe family, friends, teachers, collateral witnesses who can talk to me about those factors, that this child has had a gender issue very early on and has been persistent, insistent, and consistent. Am I on the right track there?
Well, to an extent, that would probably be helpful, but I think that many children, children are smart, right? Children are much smarter than we often give them credit for. And they know when it is safe to be themselves and when it is not, right? And so a child may be insistent, consistent, and persistent with supportive parent and not with non-supportive parent, because the few times that the child has been insistent with non-supportive parent, it's been very clear that that behavior is not acceptable with that parent, right? And so I think that you're going to end up with very conflicting reports based on where the child is supported and where the child is not supported, which is why, in fact, the medical diagnosis, I think, has a higher level of need than sort of what everybody in the kid's life is saying, because the medical doctor is an objective outside expert who is looking at it without sort of a preconceived notion, without a desire to diagnose this child as transgender or not, right? Just to see what's happening. So I think that that's, you know, probably more important.
And I would imagine that the expert has diagnostic tools or assessments they're using, but I'm also imagining that they also incorporate those factors as well. I mean, there isn't a, you tell me, um, there isn't a medical diagnosis where you can look at, um, testing of the child, physical testing of the child, blood tests, and so on, and tell that that child um, has a gender dysphoria.
Right, so it's mental health testing, and so
Mental
the
health testing.
diagnostic and statistical models, I was DSM, I think it's model. I think their latest iteration is number 5, so DSM-5 has gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, and they have, their list of these are the things that you would look for, and whatever it is, 5 out of 7, or, in the same way that they have all kinds of other diagnostic models in there.
Just curious, do you have a copy of the DSM-5 handbook?
Not with me at the moment. I think there's probably one lying around somewhere, but it's been a long time.
That came out of nowhere. I used to have a copy actually. It was back before.
My mother's an occupational therapist. I know she had a copy lying around when I was a kid. I'm not sure I ever bought my own version.
There's no reason why a family lawyer would have that. In bedtime reading to make you go to sleep. I don't know.
Oh yeah, it would certainly put you to sleep.
So, are you aware of any cases where in Los Angeles or in California where a judge has granted legal custody to one parent who encourages and wants to support the transition?
Not published. I'm not aware of any published cases in California where that's happened. I think that it has happened sort of at the trial level, right? But that just kind of goes away quietly. The published decisions for transgender parents and children are overall not very positive. Usually supportive parents lose their kids and transgender parents lose their kids. So we generally in the community will do everything we can to stay out of court if possible, because it's just the odds of you being able to fully educate a judge who may have zero knowledge and understanding of this concept are low. And generally speaking, I think that when people say we just don't know, they would rather go with, just let the kid wait till they're 18. If they still feel this way, they can do it when they're 18, right? Or, this parent could potentially hurt the child's mental by being a transgender parent. We would rather not have that in the child's life. So I think judges tend to be cautious and conservative when it comes to children's well-being. And unfortunately, I think that in these cases, it is the opposite of what these families usually need, not always, but often. So generally, we will try to keep things out of court if possible and, mediate and negotiate without involving a judge. Because just like any other family law case, right, you always tell people, if you make the decision with your ex, you might not be happy with every little piece of that decision, but you too will have made that decision. If you go to a judge, you've lost power and control over that decision because now the judge is making it.
There is a slight difference, though, based on what I understand to be the statistics, that if you make a bad legal decision or a decision over legal custody, which is incorrect, it has consequences, obviously, but with a teen who wants to transition, to deny that transition, I understand that suicide rates amongst transgender teens is very high. So it could have very big consequences.
Yeah.
Do you have any statistics, or can you talk about suicide amongst transgender teens?
I don't have the comparative statistics off the top of my head. I can tell you where to go to find them though. So the major studies are the US Transgender Survey and the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. The US Transgender Survey, or USTS, is the most recent version, and they surveyed over 30,000 transgender and non-binary people, and they looked at suicide rates. And what's interesting is they do a lot of comparison of rates among people who have family support and don't have family support and all kinds of things like that, right? So, and it also varies by age, because 30 years ago, almost no one was transitioning before they were 18. It wasn't heard of, right? People didn't have access to the resources to be able to transition as children, and they certainly didn't have access to supportive parents back then. And so a lot of people from older generations transitioned as adults. we're seeing younger and younger transition now that the world is sort of learning and understanding about transgender and creating a space for people to be able to do that at younger ages.
Now, the other side of the coin is we talked about children who want to transition. What about the parents? What about a parent that wants to transition and they separate? Now they're arguing over who has custody of the child. In California, we have a very vague, broad best interest test that gives incredible latitude to a judge to make a decision about what is in the best interest of the children. We focus on the best interest of the children. Now, I'm imagining that if you go in front of maybe an older family court judge, and you're representing the parent who's not transitioning, I suppose they're going to make lots of arguments that, well, it's a transitioning parent or a parent who undergoes reassignment. It's going to be very harmful and detrimental to the child's mental health. Or they may argue that's a very selfish thing to do, so self-indulgent thing to do, and it's going to negatively impact the child. How do you address those kind of concerns and arguments?
Yeah, so those are the typical arguments that come out in these kinds of cases. And usually for the transgender parent, the best thing that they can do is, again, involve a mental health professional. So telling your child that you're transitioning is not a small thing, right? I would imagine that in some respects there would be similarity to like telling your child you're marrying a new spouse, right? It's a big change in a child's life. And so any sort of big change, you have to be able to do that in a kind and thoughtful way, and working with mental health professionals who can help you to have that conversation with your children in an age appropriate way, also depending upon the age of your children, and helping them to sort of walk with the person through their transition. So it's not just like one day a parent showed up as one gender and the next day they were, maybe 6 months go by and suddenly there's a completely different person showing up at the door, right? That's going to be jarring to anyone. And so, I think it's really important that we are able to think about how to do this in a way that is appropriate and helping the child to come along through the process.
Does the effect of that kind of exposure to a child vary depending on the age of the child? Are there studies on that?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, the younger the child is during the transition, the less of an issue it is, which makes sense, right? I mean, if you have a parent who was transgender before you were born and transitioned before you were born, that's just part of your story, right? It's not a shock, it's not a change. And if it happens when you're very young, right? Like, it's just like, okay, this is happening, and you kind of go along with it. But yeah, it generally is so there's a study, if you search my name and transgender parenting, so Hazel Bush and transgender parenting. I co-wrote a study with Jody Herman and Rebecca Stotzer, where we kind of did a lit review of all of the research on transgender parents. This was back in 2014, so it's a little dated at this point. But it did find that, yes, the older the child was, the harder the transition could be for the parent.
Is there a particular age or a boundary there where it becomes, exponentially more difficult for the child to adjust?
I don't recall seeing that. And again, I don't know that it's necessarily about the age. I think especially if you have two parents who are co-parenting amicably and who are both on board, it doesn't have to be this really dramatic or drastic thing. It's really more about framing it and making sure that everyone is supportive and working together, as opposed to, obviously, if you have one parent who's saying, well, mommy or daddy's gone crazy and they, now they want to be somebody else. And, obviously that is going to be very hard for a child to handle.
And that's true generally of any custody outcomes, if the parents are cooperative and work together and are very amicable, and they are understanding and supportive of each other and of the children, the outcomes, all the outcomes, mental health outcomes, social outcomes, economic outcomes, are better than if they go to court and fight, in court. Are there any cases in California about transgendered custody cases?
Not published cases, not to my knowledge. So yeah, it's all sort of, you ask the lawyers who do this a lot and you kind of find out what's been happening on the ground, and it really does depend on your judge. You know, it's very, very, like you said, there's wide latitude with each judge.
And I'm kind of interested here because I think, would you think it would depend? I mean, for example, if you have a gay judge, do you think they will be more receptive and understanding, or maybe more knowledgeable about these issues than a non-gay judge? Or is that a really politically sensitive question to ask?
I mean, I think the truth is maybe, but maybe not. There are plenty of gay people who don't have any experience with transgender people, or don't have a lot of knowledge about it. And so I don't think that assuming that a judge who's gay would sort of be able to do this any better than a judge who's straight is necessarily the case. If you had a transgender judge, I think obviously they would understand the process better, but I wouldn't assume that a gay or bisexual judge would.
Okay, because I mean, because of the term LGBT, and that acronym keeps changing and getting longer and longer in the last couple of years. I always assumed that you kind of, and this is probably a really wrong assumption, but you just lump all these terms together, and everybody in that group is very understanding and supportive of each other. You're saying that's not true.
Not necessarily. I mean, I certainly hope so, and but I think especially for transgender people, if you are attracted to only one gender, then either prior to or after your transition, you will end up being gay, right? If I'm a woman and I transition to be a man and I'm attracted to men, then I went from a straight woman to a gay man, right? So at some point, I'm going to be L or B if I'm only attracted to one gender in my transition, which is, I think, a lot of why it makes sense to sort of group them. But that being said, there's a lot of discrimination within the LGBT community. There's discrimination against bisexual people. There's discrimination against transgender people. It's not a perfect world anywhere, even within, just the way there's discrimination within other minority communities.
Right. Let me pull this back to law and family law.
Okay.
So I want to go back a little bit because one of the other issues that you deal with, I think, is where there's a transition and you have to change the documents that show your identity. And I'm thinking of things like driver's licenses, name changes, or even changing the child's name at school if they're gender non-conforming. So for example, let's start with birth certificates.
Okay.
In California, can you change your birth certificate if you transition?
Yep, you can change your birth certificate. So the way that you change your birth certificate in California, there actually, I believe, is an administrative way to do it, which I never recommend. So I always recommend you go through a judicial process if this is something you are permanently ready to do. The short explanation of that is that the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution protects judgments from one state to the next. It doesn't necessarily protect administrative documents. So for example, before we had marriage equality across the land, people could get married in California and go to Alabama, and their marriage certificate was not recognized, right? So even if there is a way to just administratively change your birth certificate, I don't recommend that because there could be other states that wouldn't recognize it. But by having a judgment that changes your name and gender, that has to be recognized across every state in the country. So
I'm going to say now, for the record, I don't have any friends or family in Alabama. So in our hypotheticals, we could just use Alabama as the state that's behind the curve compared to California.
It could be, there are plenty
It could be other states.
Could be problems. Yes, I just use Alabama as an example.
Right. You need to check on each state to see what their laws are.
Absolutely. So what you do is there is both a name change and gender affirmation process in the state of California. If you are changing your name to conform with gender identity, then you do not have to publish. Normally when you change your name in California for any other reason, you would have to publish in a newspaper for 4 weeks. And then you get your name changed at some point after that. It's not usually immediate because our courts aren't that fast. If you're doing it with gender, though, there's no publication requirement. You basically just file. And eventually it comes back. You get the judgment saying your name and gender have been changed. And then there are forms that you send to the Department of Vital Records to update your birth certificate. And if it's for gender, then the old birth certificate is sealed and the new one is issued to look like an original so that you don't experience discrimination based on being transgender when people see your birth certificate, right?
How long does that process take? So how long? Yeah.
It depends on the county, and it varies. I filed a name change that did not have gender in it before COVID, and it took like 20, 30 weeks, a very long time. I filed a name and gender change in the middle of COVID, and it was done in like 6 or 8 weeks. So it just depends. There's one judge in LA County in Stanley Moss, who was doing all the name and gender changes. His courtroom got split into 2, so I think 2 judges are dealing with it now. So it probably just depends on what's on their dockets. But I tell people typically expect about 12 weeks for the judicial process. And then each administrative process, I would give it another minimum of 12 weeks. And Vital Records is extremely nitpicky when you file your forms. If you use the wrong ink color, if you breathe on it improperly, they will reject it. So I tell people, be prepared for rejection and then starting your clock over again, because that's very, very common with Vital Records.
So based on what you said, I'm concluding that it might be a good idea to retain an attorney, someone like yourself, in order to expedite and get it right the first time.
Yeah, unless you're very, very patient. And I will admit, even when I do it and I do it right, sometimes Vital Records changes what they want. So these things, I think if you are not feeling patient and you don't want to deal with it, it's absolutely something that I can help with, or other attorneys who do this can help with. And we can also think about, we know things like you have to change your name with Social Security before you go to change your driver's license, so we know kind of the order of operations. If you go to your driver's license and you haven't fixed Social Security, it's not going to work. So, you have to kind of think through all the different steps.
So the first thing to do would be to change your name or change your name on the birth certificate, and then all those other documents, Social Security, driver's license, school records, that kind of thing, then flow from that name change.
Well, the first step would be to go to court and do it there. And then you actually, the birth certificate, it makes sense because usually people want the birth certificate as evidence, but that court order is really the document that you need for all of those other things. And often for schools are kind of a little bit different. If you're talking about children who are socially transitioning, sometimes schools will allow children to start using a new name without a legal name change. Schools that are sort of more hip to transgender issues may allow that option temporarily to say, okay, like this, we're going to let this child try this out for the next year and see, if this is persistent, right? And so the child is now going to go by whatever name and whatever gender. We're going to put that in the school records for now. But some schools will say, no, we can't do it until we have a judgment or a birth certificate.
Isn't that a LAUSD policy? If you're going to school in Los Angeles, I thought that LAUSD has a specific policy on that, or does it goes by from school to school?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that.
That's because you only represent people who send their kids to private schools.
The truth is, most of my clients are adults. I don't represent a ton of transgender children. And in fact, the transgender child who I was advocating on behalf of was outside of LA County and was definitely not going to private school. It was a pro bono case. So let's not make assumptions.
Okay. Another question is about, and this is a really obvious question, but I don't know the answer. If you're married and one of the spouses undergoes transition, how does that affect your marriage status? Does it have any effect whatsoever?
Legally, no. And in fact, even before we had same-sex marriage, there were court rulings that had said if a different sex couple is married and one partner transitions and now you've become a same-sex couple, they would even still recognize the marriage done. So
what if you entered into a domestic partnership and then there's transition?
Domestic partnership is actually now open to both genders as well in California. So not an issue.
Okay. Adoption. if you're and this is really kind of confusing, and I probably get the hypothetical mixed up, but a step parent gets married, they get married, and someone's a step parent. The step parent transitions. Do you have any advice about what to do about adopting the other spouse's child?
Well, I mean, that's a step parent adoption like any other step parent adoption, but you may be more likely to experience discrimination in your process if you are transgender. So back when I was in law school, I actually did some research on adoption from the foster care system, and I looked across all 50 states at sort of their documents and what they would require people to fill out to see if someone would have to disclose their transgender status as a part of the process. And the vast majority of the time, it was going to come out just by virtue of the way that the documents were written. My recommendation is that even if it's not obvious from the documents, if there's any possibility that the caseworker or the social worker is going to find out, you should be the one to be telling that person, because often it's not the information that's the problem, it's the lack of disclosure. But it depends. It depends on what county you're in. It depends on how conservative the space is. If your gender identity is going to become something that is going to result in you experiencing discrimination. There are laws in California against discrimination and adoption and fostering based on gender identity, but those still have to be enforced if you experience discrimination, which can still happen. Not everyone follows the law, unfortunately.
Health insurance. Does health insurance in California cover reassignment?
Yeah, I believe so. So health insurance is changing all the time. And California did pass a law that health insurance does need to cover medical care related to gender identity. On the national scale, we had Section 1557 of the ACA is a non-discrimination section that included non-discrimination based on sex. And under the Obama administration, it was interpreted that there were regulations put out that said non-discrimination based on sex includes gender identity in ACA policies. That has been changed. That was rolled back by the Trump administration like on a Friday, and then that Monday was the day that our Title VII case came down from the Supreme Court saying that discrimination in employment based on sex includes gender identity and sexual orientation. So likely that Supreme Court interpretation eviscerated the rollback by HHS, but it has yet to get up before a court to see what that actually will mean. But in the state of California, sorry, was that confusing?
That was an absolutely brilliant analysis. I'm just saying that was absolutely brilliant. Now, what was the name of the case? Because that case was well known because the swing judge was Neil Gorsuch, who applied a sort of a textual interpretation. And he was roundly criticized by the conservatives in the Trump administration for betraying the ideals of the conservative movement.
Right.
What was that case called? Do you remember?
Bostock.
Bostock. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying that Bostock case could apply to the ACA and the ability of people to use the ACA to get services or health insurance to cover any kind of gender reassignment.
In fact, I cannot imagine, having read Bostock in quite a lot of detail, because obviously this matters a lot for my work, I cannot imagine an interpretation of that case that would not apply it to HHS and other non-discrimination provisions and other statutes based on sex.
If you have time, I'm just looking at the time now, because Gorsuch is a fascinating figure, a very misunderstood figure. And his views on originalism and textual analysis of statutes and natural law, I could talk for hours and hours about that. But he might have a profound effect in this field. I can't think of any more. Are there any more issues that you see in your practice regarding transgender children or transgender parents?
I think we've covered a lot in a very short amount of time. I think we've hit on most of it. I think, again, just making sure that people are bringing in those mental health professionals from a very early stage, doing this in a really thoughtful way. I can't tell you how many cases I've seen where a supportive parent of a transgender child has sort of done a lot of online research and reached out to, transgender support groups and things like that, and started to help the child with their transition. And then the court has said, well, they didn't get a professional. They didn't get a medical professional. They didn't get a mental health professional. And so they self-diagnosed, and that's unacceptable. And so we're not going to allow the parent to continue to have custody.
Right. And I'm just going to type in Google, there's the Children's Hospital.
Children's Hospital, Los Angeles.
And the name of the expert there?
Mm-hmm.
What's her name, Joanna
Olson.
Olson. And so you would go there, hopefully it would be covered by your insurance. Are there other places you might go to that will provide free counseling or free services?
I think St. John's provides services. I don't know if they're free or not. But St. John's Health and Wellness, I believe is what they're called. They also have the transgender section. And again, I'm not sure they're focused on children. So Children's Hospital of Los Angeles is definitely focused on children. If that is not accessible to you, I'm absolutely sure that they could direct you to another place that is closer. But there is a lot of information. There are a ton of resources on the internet. There's nothing wrong with using the internet for research. Just make sure that if you know that this is going to be something that's going to be a challenge, it's going to be ending up before a judge, that you are bringing in the professionals early on from the beginning. Whether you're a transgender parent or you're a parent of a transgender child.
And the biggest takeaway I can get from this is if either your child or you have these kind of issues, the most important thing is to work together, bring in a mental health professional, and cooperate and talk about it, and do it in a supportive environment rather than run off to court or start throwing stones at each other. Right. Well, I want to thank you very much. I've learned a tremendous amount in less than an hour. Incredible. So I always really enjoy talking to you. Again, my name is Warren Scheel. I'm a family law attorney, divorce attorney in Los Angeles. And thank you, Amira. We're going to put your contact details in the YouTube. And thank you ever so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. End meeting. Oh, wait a minute. No, don't end meeting.